Welcome to the Charles Redd Center lecture today with Adam Sowards. We're excited to have you with us. This is a named lecture after William Howard and Harold Butler Peters lecture. And I'm Jay Buckley, the director of the Charles Redd Center. I'll tell you a little bit about Hazel. She was born in Douglas, Arizona in 1912, the fifth child of John Topham and Susan Elizabeth Redd Butler. As a young child, her health was poor, but she did well in school and graduated from the Arizona State Teachers College, which is now ASU, in 1934. She taught school in Mesa, and while she was living in the Phoenix area, she met William Howard Peters in 1941. He'd recently graduated from Stanford, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor, felt that it was his duty to volunteer for military service. So he went to the Air Force and served in the Pacific Front during the war. When he returned, he and Hazel were married in Pasadena, had 2 children together. Hazel was active in the community, served on the PTA, was the first den mother of the Cub Scouts in Glendale, and Howard served on the city council in Glendale in the 1960s. Howard passed away in 1981 and Hazel in 1995 and bequeathed an estate to the Redd Center, and so that's why we're doing this lecture now. We'll have an opening prayer by Brian Cannon, Associate Director of the Redd Center, Brendan Rensing, will introduce our speaker.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Adam Sowards is an environmental historian and writer specializing in public lands and conservation in the American West, with particular emphasis in the Pacific Northwest. He is Professor Emeritus, meaning he's retired and he's gone off to pasture, but still keeping very busy, staying probably more active and writing more than a lot of us do who are technically not retired. He taught at the University of Idaho from 2003 to 2022. Along with many articles, a very active weekly newsletter entitled Taking Bearings, which is all about public lands and environmental history and conservation and things like that, which you should subscribe to if those things interest you. A number of other forms of scholarships, articles, and so forth. He's the author of a number of books, a couple of which won some awards. In 2007, he published The United States West Coast, an Environmental History. In 2009, a book entitled The Environmental Justice, William O. Douglas and American Conservation. He was the editor of the 2014 book, Idaho's Place, A New History of the Gem State. More recently, in 2020, he published An Open Pit Visible from the Moon, The Wilderness Act and the Fight to Protect Miners Ridge. In case you thought that our own Kennecott copper mine outside Salt Lake was the only open pit mine visible from the moon, there's another Kennecott mine out there. And then most recently, just this year, Making America's Public Lands, the Contested History and Conservation on Federal Lands. We're very happy to have Adam with us. We've been happy in years past to help fund some of his travel and research for some of these projects. And when we do that, we always like to have them come and share with us what it is that they got up to. So join me in welcoming Dr. Sowards.
Thank you all for being here. And thanks to the Charles Redd Center for inviting me. And it's a real honor for me to be here. And to Brendan Rensink, who extended the invitation, I'm grateful. And to Amy Carlin, who has made all the arrangements and was extraordinarily patient with me, getting me here. And thank you for being here. I appreciate it very much. In my first serious research project that resulted in a publication, which was one I started between my junior and senior year of college, I encountered a word that I could not pronounce, and it still gives me fits. Palimpsest, I think. It came in a passage from John Muir, an important conservationist. He wrote, Brendan, you can click the PowerPoint. He wrote, "There is not a fragment in all nature, for every relative fragment of one thing is a full, harmonious unit in itself. All together form the one grand palimpsest of the world." That idea of harmony and completeness is one that I like. But I like the notion of the palimpsest even more. A palimpsest is writing material like parchment that is used repeatedly, and previous writing is scraped away, erased, but only incompletely. So over time, the parchment reveals words upon words, the passing of time leaving traces on the page. And the fragments of the past remain visible, however faintly, even to today. It is an accumulation, not an erasure. Whenever I encounter the word palimpsest, I take notice. I've been doing so for nearly 3 decades now. In Trace, Laurette Savoy's beautiful meditation on American memory, history, race, and landscape, she writes, "The American landscape is palimpsest. Layers upon layers of names and meanings lie beneath the official surface. What came before colonial maps and names was vast and long." So, as I get started on the 2022 William Howard and Hazel Butler Peters lecture, for which I am deeply honored, I want to call attention to the palimpsest of this place where we are, the home it is and has been for us and others since time immemorial. We cannot have a present free from the past. We cannot be here without a history. Today I plan to talk about my latest book. I meant to have a copy that I could hold up, but I left it in my bag. It is a synthesis of more than 200 years of history and captures a lot of the work I've done since I was a master's student in the mid-1990s, which, looking around, is before many of you were born. So boiling all of that down to the 45 minutes I've been allotted is impossible. So I'll ask in advance your forgiveness as I skim surfaces at time and then provide too many details at other moments. And I trust that the gaps will be bridgeable. My title is "The Integrity of the Public's Land, Turning Points on the Path Toward a Democratic Landscape." And the title is inspired by Utah writer and activist Terry Tempest Williams, who wrote, you can click, Brendan, in 2016, "The integrity of our public lands depends on the integrity of our public process within the open space of democracy." This is what intrigues me most about the public lands. That is, their use as a barometer of democracy. Today, the public is empowered to shape the decisions for these lands, but as Williams notes, any corruption of the political system corrupts these lands too. Only with a system of public integrity can the lands and their human and non-human inhabitants function wholly. That is, to function with integrity. Let me also make some things plain about my subtitle before I get too far into this talk. I believe strongly in democracy, by which I mean in part that citizens inform and participate in public lands questions and governance. This is hard. I believe we have a more democratic public landscape today than we did a century or two ago. It has not been uninterrupted improvement, though, and it is by no means perfect. So I mentioned turning points on the path toward a democratic landscape for the public lands, those lands owned by us all. I want us to point toward democracy. In addition to palimpsest, allow me one more useful metaphor, that of a table. I adapt this from Hannah Arendt, 20th century political philosopher, and I use it as a touchstone throughout the book, and I'll use it today as well. She focused her book, The Human Condition, on figuring out how the public realm functions in society, how political action can even occur. A table allows people to gather together without falling over each other, she wrote. It allows people to be seen and heard from different positions, each with a unique perspective on the thing that gathered them there. Gaining admission to the table does not mean people give up their identities or interests, because what is held in common is not the distinct identities, but what brought them together, the table, or in this case, the public lands. This table metaphor works to help guide us through the history of American public lands, and it helps us to think about the public lands as part of the democratic experiment that is the United States. It takes no great leap of insight to find faults and failures in meeting the promises of democracy, for the nation is rooted in the dispossession of indigenous land and the enslavement of Africans. The history of public lands includes democratic shortcomings and exclusions, just like every other part of U.S. political history. That is partly why thinking about public lands as an element in this democratic experiment is helpful, because we can see who defined the nation's lands and for what purpose, and how new ideas supplanted old ones, and how novel understandings complicated traditional views. With the lands themselves as the common object that focuses people's attention, we learn that this quintessentially American system, like the nation itself, is full of experiments, full of successes and failures and promises made, broken, and redefined. Throughout this history, the table and those gathered around it changed and multiplied, guided by evolving laws and science, not to mention shifting political interests. Like a growing family at a holiday dinner incorporating new entrees, the more interest at the table, the more cacophonous and unfamiliar it appeared to those who had been gathering there for generations. So, my first turning point is the Homestead Act of 1862. But for it to make sense, you have to understand deep context. So let's begin with the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, who after all said, "In the beginning, all the world was America." Locke believed that in a so-called state of nature, all people were free to act on their own accord, provided they did not hurt others. Further, and crucially for a history of public land, Locke saw nature as originally held in common, that is, unowned. When humans applied labor to the land, they transformed it into property to be held exclusive by owners, that is, by those who labored. A caveat. Locke and the American founders he inspired conveniently ignored two things. The land here already had caretakers who had invested generations of labor into it, and many of those who were coerced into labor on the land received no such property right. Philosophical ideas apparently run on exceptions. Thomas Jefferson may have been the most Lockean of the American founders, going so far as to hang a portrait of the philosopher in his Monticello parlor. Independent landowning, Jefferson believed, produced virtuous citizens, an article of faith planted deep in American psyches. Jefferson said this most famously in Notes on the State of Virginia in 1785. He wrote, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breast he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." If this were true, then the nation needed to ensure it possessed sufficient land to seed what Jefferson called an empire for liberty. Of course, the seeds of such an empire came from the plants of dispossession. So Jefferson helped create a system by co-authoring the Land Ordinance of 1784 that ordered how the nation's public domain would be carved up into chunks of surveyed land to be auctioned off. The next year, the Congress of the Confederation passed the Land Ordinance of 1785 and refined it further with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which etched Jefferson's ideals further into practice, both in the law and on the landscape itself. Most important, the 1785 law established a survey system by which government surveyors would divide American land into square mile sections that would be sold off by the national government. This survey process in the early republic fully integrated American land into the market. turning it into property that individuals could buy and sell. The resulting grid pattern reproduced across the continent subjected ecological systems to a legal logic nonsensical to nature, something abstracted from the material world of life on the land. The land ordinances and associated surveys codified the national project of turning public land into property. For the next half century, the nation pursued two things. The first was the acquisition of more land, a necessary requirement to fulfill the Jeffersonian dream of small farmers planting virtue and reaping a republic. Through wars and treaties, purchases and frauds, the United States acquired Louisiana and northern Mexico and Oregon Territory, eventually filling up what is now the continental United States. The second thing that Congress did was figure out ways to move the public domain into individual hands. It gave some land to soldiers as payment for service to the nation, but mostly it sold off the public domain. To buy the auctioned land required wealth, however. While the public domain looked tantalizingly democratic, it mostly was available for wealthy land speculators. But there is a restless spirit among Americans. Many moved beyond the boundaries of the nation and ahead of the survey stakes to claim the land for their own. This caused many problems for indigenous nations, and Congress did not take kindly to the squatters who pushed further west faster than Congress wanted. But the nation accommodated these rule breakers. In fact, they celebrated them. And soon Congress gave up and passed laws known as preemption laws, giving those who had outraced the official surveyors first chance to legally purchase the land on which they had already settled. The assumption of privatizing land, though, was never questioned. But Congress did want to make it easier. And that brings us to the Homestead Act, finally, in 1862. Once voters elected Abraham Lincoln in 1860, southern states began seceding, and that allowed the Republican Party to pass long-stalled legislation to advance a social vision with land transformation at its heart, and the heart beat with the Homestead Act, a plan to quickly turn the public domain into small farms. With bipartisan support and popular favor, the law passed on May 20th, 1862. It was so popular in part because of its generous terms. For heads of household, male or female, the law provided 160 acres to citizens or those who declared their intent to become them. For immigrants, the law offered a pathway to Americanization. Homesteaders then Americanized the land, while the land worked to Americanize the immigrants. The land would be free as long as the homesteader lived on the land for 5 years and improved it. Improvement bundled up a set of Jeffersonian ideologies that enshrined free labor and argued that applying reason and labor to the natural environment would ensure success for self and nation, an experience President Lincoln exemplified through his own life. How should we ultimately understand the consequences of the Homestead Act from the perspective of public land history? For the public domain, the Homestead Act accomplished its work well, getting somewhere between 270 million and 285 million acres into individuals' hands. Recently, scholars have calculated that in the West, about 2/3 of new farms between 1863 and 1900 originated as homesteads, and these met the Act's obligations between 5 and 6 times out of 10, a slight majority. The Homestead Act then continued the odyssey of transforming land into property, America's vast space into farms, public land into private fields. It symbolized the nation's agrarian logic and idealized economic and social program, but that logic would founder on the shoals of a challenging environment. Homesteading could not meet all the grand dreams that theorists and policymakers imagined for it. Conceived by a nation whose center of gravity lay in the east, it faced ecological challenges when transported out of the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys. The 160-acre homestead prize worked well for family farmers in the well-watered Midwest, but ran aground on environmental challenges west of the 100th meridian, where rainfall came more sporadically and in less quantity than most American farmers were able to accommodate. In some places it was too mountainous, in others too forested. For some activities, 160 acres was too much, for others too little. Although a majority of homesteaders across the West proved up their claims, sizable numbers did not, and in certain states, failure rates were high. Adjustments were needed. And so this brings us to the next turning point, which is the conservation movement, broadly construed and defined. And this is both a turning point and a defining moment. It's the era when public lands as a system originated. More than small adjustments to the Homestead Act came this broader conservation movement that reconceived of the public domain and began to envision the public lands as being a permanent fixture on the landscape and a counter to the sometimes greedy destruction of resources. For several reasons, then, the public domain was no longer a way station between indigenous lands to private lands. Instead, it would remain public, unclaimed, unowned in perpetuity. It started with Yellowstone. In 1872, Congress passed the Yellowstone Park Act, declaring some 2.2 million acres to be, quote, reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale under the laws of the United States, and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Congress further declared that regulations shall provide for the preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park, and their retention in their natural condition. These passages announced something new in American land policy: preservation and retention of natural areas, no extraction, no ownership. Some of the public domain, at least, would remain permanently public, protected by a transformed and powerful federal government. But inspiration from scenery alone could not carry the load all the way to conservation. Problems with the economic relationship between Americans and their land provided the spark to inspiration's tinder. A scientific critique emerged from George Perkins Marsh and others, purporting to explain the fundamental misalignment between Americans' economic activities and the land's capacity to withstand it. Logging, ranching, and mining all beat up the land in the 19th century, and not on a small scale. The extractive nature of these industries assaulted the public domain, reaping profits while the public received only a deteriorating environment in return. There were no fees or royalties collected for taking timber or minerals or using range resources. The wealth acquired from natural resources often came from devastating them and the working communities left behind. A backlash started forming against the rapacious business practices that destroyed landscapes. As early as 1873, the American Association for the Advancement of Science convened a committee to study forest protection. The American Forest Association formed 2 years later. The first federal forester, Franklin Hough, was appointed in 1876 to study the nation's forest conditions. His report on forestry in 1878 opened with his fears, having watched the wasting of supplies and the complete exhaustion of one forest region after another, with an anxiety natural with those who look forward to the provable conditions that must necessarily exist in another generation, and who feel the responsibilities of the present with regard to the future. That eye toward the future marked one of conservation's important insights, but property traditions made protecting forests hard. Hough's report signaled increasing interest among government agents. Just the year before his report on forestry, the Secretary of Interior, Carl Schurz's own report, devoted space to the problems of American forests too, stating that he also favored reserving forests for fear of what was commonly believed to be a coming timber famine. Other government departments, as well as a Public Lands Commission, assessed the West's forests in similar terms. Evidence of problems accumulated, and reform pulsed in the air. But Congress is a slow, deliberative body, not a fast-moving one. In 1885, Congress introduced 6 unsuccessful bills to create public forest reserves, with similar results in 1888, 1889, and 1890. In 1891, finally, Congress passed a law, the General Revision Act, that charted a new path forward. The law repealed several land laws, but included one section in a single sentence that gave the president the power to reserve forest lands. The section reversed the long-standing trend established in the 1780s of selling all the continent's land. Within a month of signing the bill, President Benjamin Harrison proclaimed the first reserve, Yellowstone Forest Reserve, adjacent to the First National Park. By the end of 1892, 13 million acres of forest land were protected. The next president continued, and on we went. But it took more than a decade for Congress to create the Forest Service to manage these forest reserves, soon renamed national forests. Gifford Pinchot was put in charge, and he largely developed the ethos and identity for the agency. The letter that outlined his duties established an ideal for the national forest system that guided the agency for decades and still matters. It is worth quoting extensively, but I'll just summarize a few key points instead. The reserves were to be productive, that is, they were to be used. They were to be permanent, that is, they were not open for private ownership. They were meant to be permanently used, that is, harvesting needed to be conservative so that it would not alter long-term value. And the reserves focused on helping the home builder first of all, not the timber corporations or mining companies. The reserves hoped to serve local communities and decide in local favor, but if conflict arose, it would be decided by determining what was the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. A phrase that guided the Forest Service's management orientation and goals. Even today, much of the public still identifies with that. Finally, that letter evinces both Pinchot's populism in standing for the whole people and his anti-democratic tendencies with a strong belief that scientists and other experts should manage resources without input from the politicians or the people. So the Pinchot letter encapsulates all the hopes and paradoxes and seeds for growth and conflict that would challenge federal forestry and really conservation more broadly ever since. The development of conservation on public lands from this turn-of-the-century moment onward is a rich, complicated history, but I need to move through the decades fast, so permit me to summarize, please. We've moved from an ideal that the land should be property and government should provide it to the possibility that some land, especially forests and scenic places, might remain under federal control. For the next half century or so, the federal lands agencies, the Forest Service, the Park Service, and by the 1940s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, all of these agencies figured out their missions and improved on their ability to deliver outcomes. Those outcomes very often focused on controlling various factors in order to maximize what was desired. Some examples. To maximize livestock, federal managers controlled, that is, killed, predators. To maximize timber, federal foresters controlled or tried to control fires while attempting to grow more trees. To maximize hunting and ducks, federal wildlife refuges controlled water and feeding. And to maximize visitation, park rangers built roads and trails and parking lots and visitor centers. During the decades from, say, the 1920s to the 1950s, these federal conservation agencies tried to repair damage done to the land by timber trespassers and ranchers who had overstocked arid rangelands and the like. They tried to impose regulations that would fulfill the greatest good ideal and not forget the in the long run time frame. They learned how to work with the public or select parts of it to ensure that public resources could be used productively. And perhaps inevitably, in a nation so enmeshed with capitalism, often public lands became just another place to exploit for profit. Board feet, animal unit months, and interest fees ruled over wildlife, scenery, and watersheds with ecological integrity. And that metaphoric table of the public lands remained tight-knit, closed off, mostly exclusive. But values and priorities change, which leads us to another turning point. The lands agency's managerial hands proved too heavy for broad parts of the American public. Beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the next decade, advocates demanded stronger environmental protection and greater input from the public for management actions. In response, Congress passed a series of laws that transformed the legal landscape on which public lands rested, and did so in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. Between 1964 and 1976, a series of revolutionary laws transformed conservation and democracy and the landscape. Every major piece of legislation had its advocates and unique history. Each one deserves a long discussion, but again, I only have 45 minutes. When considering this era in full, 3 changes seem most prominent and important to me. First, laws like the Wilderness Act and the Endangered Species Act established much stricter protection over some places and some species. Wilderness lands allowed no motors, no mechanization, no commercial activity, while the continuation of species became a goal of federal legislation. Second, new laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, required an assessment of potential environmental harms to be explicit. NEPA included public input as part of regular operating procedures, breaking the stranglehold agencies often held, and promoted greater democratic governance over the public's land. 3, laws like the National Forest Management Act and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act reoriented how the Forest Service and BLM managed their lands, including the requirement for longer-term plans that incorporated new environmental values and democratic values and broader scientific evidence. Laws Congress passed between 64 and 76 disrupted age-old patterns where the agencies largely felt insulated from supervision. They were often slow to implement and even resisted these measures. The Forest Service, for instance, stalled its wilderness review process and also increased its timber harvest program. Despite this reluctance and obstinacy, the new circumstances transformed agencies. The planning requirements modified hiring practices in ways that diversified agency personnel dramatically, adding more biologists and other interdisciplinary scientists to meet the mandates of this legislation. At the same time, the agency also diversified their gender and racial composition to better reflect the American public. Meanwhile, by focusing on a broader concept of the public interest, which included recreation and wildlife values along with economic concerns, different priorities emerged in discussions about public lands management, including things that would have been unheard of just a few years before, such as reintroducing predators or protecting solitude. Consider how changed the table looked, how many new people and perspectives and ideas were present. More voices meant more conflict, though, because democracy is noisy when more people are allowed to participate. Consequently, the public lands seemed far, far more politicized by 1980 than they had in 1950. And if you had been one of those people who had long held a position at the table, this new configuration meant you felt your power had diminished. So, another turning point and a reaction. Twin Spring Ranch rests a little south of Nevada's Center Point in an isolated spot about 70 miles east of Tonopah, the nearest town today. The Fellini family moved onto this land in the 1870s, acquiring water rights and using the public domain to graze cattle. As the family built their livestock operation, they bumped into federal policies that kept changing. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 threatened the Fellinis' slim profit margins. Then came World War II, and a bombing range required some of the lands they traditionally used. And then came the Cold War, during which the Atomic Energy Commission moved onto the range for its atomic testing program. By 1971, the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act introduced yet another purpose and priority for these public lands. When the Federal Land Policy and Management Act passed in 1976, the Fellinis and many other Nevadans and Westerners felt overwhelmed, confused, and frustrated. The BLM regulated the Fellini's activities to an unprecedented degree. When Helen Fellini sat for an oral history in the late 1980s, she frankly and simply explained what the experience felt like. The BLM has been nothing but a pain in the butt. Fellini desired some certainty and stability in policy rather than what seemed like frequent shifts in policies that ate into the family's customary range and their ability to profit from a livestock operation in an American outback. She was not alone in her frustration. Farther south in the state, nearly in Arizona, a town called Bunkerville sat in the Mojave Desert with the Virgin River running through it, drenching the place in symbolism. This was the habitat for the desert tortoise and a few hardscrabble ranchers, both endangered species. In 1991, the desert tortoise at home in these hinterlands was listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as an endangered species. Cattle grazing and tortoise habitat did not mix well. So in 1993, the BLM modified the grazing permits of a rancher named Cliven Bundy. Limiting the number of livestock in fragile desert ecosystems seemed like one intrusion too far. Bundy released nearly 9 times his permitted animals on the range and then stopped paying his grazing fees. By 2014, the fees and penalties he owed the federal government exceeded $1 million. When federal agents failed to obtain the past due payments, they informed Bundy that they would confiscate his cattle. Bundy called for support, and militia members came from around the country to support him and to intimidate federal law enforcement agents. The citizen effort to stymie the government worked as the agents left without any cattle or payment. These two snapshots share similarities. Nevada ranchers, frustrated with the new public lands regime, established in the wake of political and legal shifts of the 60s and 70s. Suddenly, it seemed to them, the public land on which they and many other resource users depended had been closed or restricted. Their livelihoods hung in the balance, and their sense of identity rooted in the land was threatened. Meanwhile, environmentalists seemed to be only interested in wildlife and plants and disdained hardworking Americans. They came from cities and did not understand rural America or rural Americans. And somehow this group had captured the Democratic Party and the levers of power in government. At least this was how it might have seemed to the Fellinis, the Bundys, or their neighbors, and similarly situated Westerners in ranching communities and timber towns. This description largely caricatured environmentalists and distorted causes and consequences. However, its symbolic power is real. These snapshots also might suggest that federal initiatives through Public Lands Agency consistently protected ecosystems and the flora and fauna that depended on them. Yet in this era, from the 1980s to the present, environmentalists and scientists routinely believed conservation measures were too meager to protect biodiversity and too often favored resource extraction over the more benign land uses such as backpacking or tourism. And this dissatisfaction that seemed ubiquitous spelled polarization, a theme consistent with the broader cultural and political trends of our times. The table no longer seemed a place around which Americans gathered to work out a public lands agenda that valued or even tolerated multiple perspectives. Instead, it was like a long picnic table with 2 benches farther and farther apart, and those seated could only see an opponent across a widening gap and not even hear all of those on their same side. On a few occasions, small groups worked out collaborations and compromises against this larger backdrop of polarization. As always, public lands history reflected national trends. A satellite image of southeastern Utah shows few roads and a lot of rugged territory. In 2015, 5 tribal governments, Hopi Tribe, Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, Pueblo of Zuni, and Ute Indian Tribe, joined the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition to collaborate and press for federal protection of nearly 2 million acres of the region known as Bears Ears. Worried about further depredations and destruction in the area, a coalition urged a solution. Consistent with the political tenor of the age, resolution came slowly and with controversy. In the final years of the Barack Obama administration, the Republican-led Congress attempted to craft a solution, but the proposal was a non-starter. So in the final days of his presidency, responding to the Intertribal Coalition, President Obama set aside as a national monument more than 1.3 million acres, 500,000 acres shy of what the coalition wanted. Nevertheless, the monument was a historic one. Consider this. Indigenous peoples shared a continent, holding land and its fruits in common, a gift from the Creator to be used and enjoyed by all. When colonists invaded North America, they brought with them an ideology about private property that transformed indigenous common lands into parcels controlled by individuals. Even when the United States government decided to maintain some areas as common forests, parks, rangelands, and refuges, Native peoples were excluded. Those public lands were carved from ceded and unceded territories and sometimes from Indian reservations. And these reductions were not consigned long ago to the 19th century or before. Federal Indian policy in the 1950s saw hundreds of thousands of acres sold out from indigenous control and purchased by timber companies or placed in national forests or wildlife refuges. Policies practiced on protected lands routinely violated treaty arrangements. The Conservation Project has consistently eroded indigenous sovereignty. Still, despite all these ways public lands had failed for tribal people, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition turned to federal conservation for support. Bears Ears became the first Native-initiated national monument, a point of pride, and for many, a hopeful signal of change. Short note, the Trump administration shrunk this and other monuments, but they've been restored under the Biden administration with the leadership of Deb Haaland, the first Interior Secretary who is indigenous, including making this monument co-managed with the local tribes. So amid such conflict on public lands and more broadly in our nation, hope can be hard to find. In January 2016, Cliven Bundy's son, Ammon, and allies occupied Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon for more than a month, claiming they wished to return the land to the original settlers. Bundy meant white ranchers, though, not the Burns Paiute tribe, on whose land the Malheur Refuge sat. Frequently, in these public lands controversies, opponents of federal lands call for them to be returned to the states, but in almost no case were federal lands ever state land to begin with. Their call merely announced a misunderstanding of history and an allegiance to legal interpretations and principles that enjoyed no standing in the courts or history, but played well with a sliver of the public. The Bundy family's opposition to federal power and conservation laws attracted all sorts of radicals to the refuge, few of whom demonstrated accurate historical knowledge about the public land system generally, or the Malheur experience specifically. The occupiers of the refuge ostensibly came to Burns, Oregon to support local ranchers, but they hoped they would inspire a wider uprising. The ranchers, Dwight Hammond and his son Stephen, faced ongoing conflicts with local federal agencies, including Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM. It reached back more than 2 decades. In the mid-1990s, during the heyday of the polarizing wise use movement, the Hammonds interfered with the Malheur Refuge staff, tearing down fences and preventing them from being rebuilt. They also threatened violence against federal employees. A refuge manager recalled that one of the Hammonds once said, "They would tear off my head," and I can't repeat how he finished that threat. The period's anti-government hostility reflected in such threats helped shock the local community into trying to lessen the tensions. So Harney County collaborated with the High Desert Partnership, doing important work to build relationships across the county, a painstaking process that yielded fragile alliances and improved resilience in local ecological and human communities across public and private boundaries. Harney County was not the same place it had been in the 1990s. A commitment to collaboration had weakened polarization and strengthened the community, helping it resist the incendiary rhetoric and activities of Bundy and his followers. Many lessons might be taken from the Malheur takeover. The geographer Peter Walker spent time in Harney County during the occupation, and he concluded his book, Sagebrush Collaboration, with a poignant point. Instead of glamorous revolution, Harney County returned to the unglamorous, time-consuming, sometimes tedious, but often effective work of sitting across the table with people of different viewpoints to find mutually beneficial, practical solutions to shared problems. In a time of political polarization, the choice to walk away is easily made, and yet the choice to stay can reveal our common ground. Terry Tempest Williams describes a similar moment in her book, The Hour of Land. Representatives of a dozen Southwest communities and organizations sat around a table, gathered there to discuss protecting land in southern Utah, what became Bears Ears. Separate parties drew maps and then shared them. What we quickly recognized, Williams related, was that we all wanted the same thing, and that the boundaries we had drawn separately were closer together than anyone knew once we gathered around one common table of concern. The stories from Oregon and Utah suggest that tables, real and figurative, work, just as Hannah Arendt theorized. This point is not meant to suggest that using and governing public lands in the future will be, can be, or should be easy. It never has been. The work of living within environmental constraints is among world history's most complicated and important tasks, and the exercise of democracy in a diverse and complicated society like the United States challenges citizens and their elected leaders to set aside narrow interests and seek a broader public interest. To make matters even harder, the 20th century includes problems of climate change, biodiversity crashes, and political corruption. Moving toward the future, public lands can and should play a central role in combating these compounding crises. Recall Williams's words, quoted at the beginning of my presentation. The integrity of our public lands depends upon the integrity of our public process within the open space of democracy. Promoting and maintaining that integrity demands an honest reckoning with history, a past that includes the exploitation of people and the land, as well as the protection of places and democracy. The Potawatomi writer Robin Wall Kimmerer stated, "The very land on which we stand is our foundation and can be a source of shared identity and common cause." The task before us, then, is to ensure that our common forests, parks, rangelands, and refuges, scattered across the nation, function as the public's land, and not the preserve of one group or another, for that undermines the promise of a democratic and ecological citizenship that might bind the nation together. One way we might begin to repair the earth and our politics is with the public's land. The next layer of the palimpsest of our public lands and our democracy is up to us to write. Thank you. I'm told we have the room for a while, so I can entertain questions. Please.
Thank you for that. I mean, I love the kind of sense of contestation over time. I have a question that has to do with change over time or potentially continuity. It seems to me that Ammon Bundy and that crowd, I'm a coastal elite living in Springville, Utah, so this is from an outsider perspective. Seems like a new brand of crazy, and like so many of 21st century American crazies, a new brand of dangerous. Would you emphasize the novelty of them, or are they in continuity with previous people that you've studied?
That's a good question. And I think I would say it's a difference in degree, not kind. When the first conservation laws were passed and the Forest Service was created and those sorts of things, there certainly was resistance in local communities. And many of the arguments that the federal government doesn't have the right to do this those arguments were made 120 years ago as well. it does seem ramped up and slightly shifted. I probably would go on the side of an accelerated continuation rather than something really new, if you had to pin me down right now.
Yeah.
I think there was a hand in the back and then up front again.
Yeah, at the end you brought up something that concerns me, which is of course climate change, because this whole history was self-contained within the United States, and we didn't need to worry about any other actors in any other part of the world. Of course, climate change, the entire world's fossil fuel burning affects our ecosystem here. How does that change the table and what we have to do to come to the table?
Wow, no one's asked me that before.
It's a tough question.
It is a tough question, and I have to confess, just having not thought about it. I've only thought about this system within the context of the United States. Certainly, I have thought about how climate change is an issue that's on that table that the people gathered around have to deal with, but I've not thought about, like, how do we deal with carbon emissions from China and those sorts of things. So I have nothing intelligent to say, but I will walk away and come up with an answer so the next time someone asks me this question, I don't look like a deer in the headlights. That's a really good question. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the transitions that you talk about in your book and today kind of puzzled me a bit. You talk about how so many of those acts were passed during the 60s and 70s with like overwhelming bipartisan support, and bulk of which was during the Nixon administration. And it's so quickly to go from the FLIPMA to the Sagebrush Rebellion. That polarization seems to happen so quickly, especially during the Carter administration. Why do you think it happened so quickly? Why do you think that political polarization kind of came about so quickly?
Well, I'll give you the quick historian's answer. Well, it's complicated. FLIPMA was almost the final straw. I think the final straw was Alaska and what happened during the Carter administration. And I think like the general trend of failing liberals in the 1970s accelerates through the decades, so that we get the Sagebrush Rebellion right at the end. You get the rise of the New Right and a reaction against the achievements of liberalism that had gone on through this 1960s and 1970s, not just with public land stuff, but civil rights things and all of those welfare, all of that stuff, Great Society, Johnson administration sort of thing. So it's fast only if you're not looking at the bubbling animosity that is there through the 60s and 70s. I think one reason we have the overwhelming bipartisanship of all of those laws in the 60s and 70s is because compromises had been worked out ahead of time. So if you had said, like the first idea of what the Wilderness Act was going to be, that would not have gotten the votes that it got, with only, I think, 4 dissenting votes when that was passed. But it took 8 years and more than 100 revisions of that law to get it to that point. And I don't know why it is, I'm not a congressional scholar, so I don't know why it is that that element of compromise within the chambers of Congress is a lost art, if you will. I'm not quite sure why that has happened. But I guess it doesn't seem that fast to me, because I see sowing the seeds of it, and the antagonism had been going on for a while. And maybe that's not a satisfying answer. But it is complicated. I'll go back to my initial reaction. Are there other questions? I think we have more time.
Well, thank you